Hey guys, today we're going to start a little bit of a series for me with Prismatic Warlock. We just got the exotic class items and we're going to be talking about those a little bit at the end of the video. However, the exotic class items on Warlock are overall not all that game changing. There's a couple of cool things and we'll definitely talk about that. However, the bulk of the power from Prismatic Warlock does come from the subclass itself, so we're going to get into all of those details. There's definitely a lot of ways to build the class to be effective, so we're going to be looking at some of those ways and what you can do to help out your team and yourself. So let's go ahead and get into the details and look at Prismatic Warlock. So something really interesting about Prismatic that really isn't the case for other builds is that there are genuinely multiple good ways to run it, and they're similarly effective, at least for different situations. I think the greatest example of this on Warlock especially is the difference between Song of Flame and Needlestorm. Song of Flame obviously has super good survivability, and it helps you out with the tougher enemies, stuff like Tormentors and such, where they take extra super damage and you don't have to land crits and you could still do good damage. However, Needlestorm obviously is just instant damage and quite a lot of damage, and is super good for that. Most other builds in the game, there's basically just one super that is the obvious best, and that's what you use, and Prismatic is genuinely different, and that is really interesting. So this is not necessarily going to be showing off one specific build. I'm probably just going to share the build I happen to use the most with a link, but also tell you guys all the different variations you can make to sort of turn this into your own build, because that's what Prismatic really is. So starting off with my favorite on Warlock, this is definitely the one I have the most time playing with and I feel the most familiar about. So I took a pretty weird approach to Prismatic Warlock than what most people did. I have absolutely loved using Necrotic Grips with it, and we have Necrotic Grips on the exotic class items, so obviously that is a great choice to go with. Similar to how it was on Strand Warlock, Necrotic Grips, it mixes really well with the Arcane Needle melee because that applies the Unravel, and the Unravel gets procced by extra damage, which is triggered by the Necrotics immediately, spreads to other enemies who also get the Necrotics, and spreads even more Unravel, so it sort of just leads to you spreading this double debuff damage effect that just kills all the adds quite a bit faster than normally using Necrotics, and it also just adds a ton of value to your melee overall, and it really makes your melee damage scale better into harder content, where a lot of the time the melee doesn't one-shot, but the melee followed by a few seconds does with Necrotics. And on the topic of melees, the only other really good melee I would go with on here is going to be the Incinerator Snap. I think it's pretty well known that the Incinerator Snap is one of the best melees in the game overall. It is very powerful, you could still get an ignition even without Ember of Ashes very easily. And if you are using a dark weapon for your ag clear, then I would definitely highly recommend running the Snap because it will get you a ton of light transcendence energy that you might be missing from your weapons. So moving on from the melee, let's talk about the grenade now, and again, I think there are two main options for the grenade right now. First one, for your actual dealing damage, I recommend the Storm Grenade, and you could also use the Healing Grenade as a utility if your build fits that in. And it's worth noting that you can use the aspect for Bleak Watcher, which would let you turn either of these grenades into a stasis turret, which kind of adds even more utility to your grenade overall, especially with the Healing Grenade where you can either use it to heal or use it offensively to freeze enemies. Now getting into probably the most interesting part about the Prismatic Warlock is going to be the aspects. And in my eyes, there are three main picks, at least if you're going for a powerful meta tier build. First of all, it's going to be Feed the Void. I think this aspect is just unbeatable on Prismatic at least. On Void, it's a little bit more questionable because your melee is kind of bad, and your utility extra ability of the Child of the Old Gods doesn't really get kills, and you're basically left with only a grenade, and the Void grenades are pretty mid as well, so you're just not having very great uptime on Devour. However, when it comes to Prismatic, you've got the much more powerful Storm Grenade to proc Devour, and you could also even use something like Hellion for your Devour procs as well, and a Hellion actually does do decent damage. We'll be talking about that in a little bit more. Or obviously the melees, they're quite a bit better on here. The Arcane Needle is not the best at proccing Devour, so I would make sure you have Storm Grenade if you are running that. However, the Incinerator Snap will basically always proc Devour for you because that melee is absolutely insane. The next one we'll talk about is Bleak Watcher, and this is the aspect I would pair with Feed the Void when you're doing super hard content. Obviously, stasis turrets don't really have a lot of use when you could just kill enemies quickly and they don't do that much damage to you. However, if you run something like a Grandmaster raid or a Master raid or a Day 1 raid even, the stasis turret can get quite a bit of use, and now that you have a more powerful grenade to pair for it, it actually makes it an interesting choice between throwing your grenade to get quick devour and do damage, or charging it up into a stasis turret and using it to sort of stop enemies from shooting you. You should also remember that you can get devour by shattering the frozen enemies from the turret. However, this is a little bit inconsistent, it doesn't seem to always work, so you should bear that in mind. And the last thing that I'm going to talk about is the Hellion. The Hellion is something I kind of blew off at first because, Arc Soul's not that good, and I figured Hellion was just, Solar Arc Soul. But the Hellion does have a couple of merits that we're going to talk about here. So the first thing is that the Hellion just does more damage than Arc Souls. Funny enough, it just is more damage. And the other great thing about it is it adds a pretty significant amount of Scorch stacks, so it can actually trigger ignitions. I want to say it needs 3 Hellion direct hits to hit a ignition, and obviously the ignition would add quite a bit more damage. The Hellion could also add value if you're using Dragon's Breath for damage, for example. Another reason I really like Hellion is if I'm using the Song of Flame, I can get ignitions more frequently because it is adding Scorch on top of the Snap and the Grenade as well, which obviously gives even more damage because the super ignitions are quite a bit higher than regular ones. And also, of course, the Hellion can also steal your kills with your weapons, which might sound like a bad thing, but because it's an ability, this will trigger your Devour on Feed the Void, which is again super powerful, at least on Prismatic. So the last part, and also probably the longest part, is going to be talking about the Prismatic Fragments, because these are oddly ranging from extremely good to literally the worst thing in the game, so we've got a couple of things to go over with this one. Because there are so many, I'm just going to go over the ones that I really like and think are super powerful, and the ones especially that I am using all the time. So my absolute favorite one, at least on Warlock, is the Facet of Purpose. And this is the one that basically gives you the healing verbs for your subclass whenever you pick up an orb. When you're playing on Warlock, you're pretty much always using either the Strand or the Solar Super, and these also happen to have one of the best healing verbs from the orbs in this fragment. Pretty much if you're on Song of Flame, you get Restoration, which I do think is a little bit more powerful in this context. And if you're on Strand, then you get access to Woven Mail. And you have to remember that this is all being mixed in with also having pretty high Devour uptime with your abilities by using Feed the Void. Remember, Devour on its own isn't really an amazing perk healing-wise, however, because it gives you grenade regen and it is also a decent bit of healing, being able to mix it with a slightly worse uptime of a better healing buff is super powerful. I think that Devour and Woven Mail, especially as a combination, kind of help each other with both of their weaknesses. Obviously, with Woven Mail, you might take less damage, but if you keep taking damage, you're eventually going to die. Whereas with Devour, if you're taking chunk damage, you're going to die pretty quickly just because you're not healing constantly and you're not reducing the damage you're taking from that chunk damage. But Woven Mail or Restoration both kind of help with that by either constantly healing you or reducing your chunk damage that you're taking. And next up, another fragment for your survivability, just to add even more to it, is the Facet of Protection. This one is straight ripped out of Arc, and it basically says you get damage resistance while you are surrounded by 3 or more enemies. This obviously has pretty good uptime in the way that the game is played these days, and it also is active when you need it most, which is obviously while you're surrounded by enemies. You're not typically taking a ton of damage if you're far away from enemies. You're typically taking more damage when you're close to enemies. So this just adds some passive DR, and when you add on the other multiple ways to get healing verbs, you end up having very high survivability on Prismatic Warlock, arguably even higher than something like Amber of Empyrean on Solar Warlock. The next big fragment I want to talk about for Warlock is the Facet of Dominance. And this one basically is just mixing 2 fragments from Void and Arc into one, however it actually does get double value on Warlocks. So I pretty much always am running Storm Grenade on my Prismatic Warlock build, and adding the Jolt to it does make it really powerful. This is one of the best fragments on Arc, just on any subclass. Adding Jolt to the grenades is super good because pretty much all the grenades can do multiple damage tags and proc the Jolt itself. It basically turns into a bomb that stuns any overloads in the area and does pretty good damage to all the adds around it, and adds a lot more splash to your grenade. As for the Void side of it, well, the Vortex Grenade is definitely weaker than the Storm Grenade in my eyes. That's not really where it shines. Where it shines is in the Prismatic Grenade, where remember our grenade is Void as well as Stasis. And so our Prismatic Grenade now also adds Void Weaken, on top of also suppressing, slowing, and eventually freezing. So that's a whole lot of effects to be gotten from a couple of grenades. and it's all just in one little fragment. And while on face value, I don't think this is the most amazing fragment on all of the classes anymore, I think it is very powerful on Warlock, and it definitely gets its most value again on Warlock. So those are what I would sort of call the core 4 fragments that are just really powerful. Pretty much the rest of the fragments can kind of be added where you want to add to your build. Obviously you do get a 5th slot when you have Feed the Void, and a 6th one if you're not using Feed the Void. So you can add more fragments, and you can kind of build these into whatever you want. If you need a specific Transcendence energy type because of the way the weapons you're using are or anything like that, that's what I would use your slot on here. I've gone with just using Facet of Justice to get extra explosions while I am Transcendent, just because it kind of helps with my ag clear. Most of the time I'm popping Transcendent because I have a need for my abilities back and I have exhausted them all and don't have a way to get them back quickly. And that is basically always happening mid-combat, so that is very helpful for me. That being said, it's very obvious that Facet of Justice is not nearly as strong as the other fragments listed. That's just sort of the one I'm putting in this flex slot where you can put kind of whatever you want. Another one you could go with is Facet of Command. This is a bit of a disappointment of a reload fragment. So it is a little bit unique compared to other fragments for reloads because it basically doesn't have a cooldown. However, it only applies to the weapon you're holding, and it requires you to either freeze or suppress, which are relatively difficult to do on command. However, that does mean it has some funny interactions with stuff like Tractor Cannon or the new Chill Clip Sniper from the raid. But if you're using weapons for DPS that have a relatively high magazine, you might be able to get use out of this by using something like Bleak Watcher. However, it's definitely not the most consistent reload. I think probably the best way to trigger on command is going Transcendent and chucking your special grenade because that does suppress. Otherwise, you could use something like the Instant Freeze melee. However, it still is kind of delayed and it's just really annoying to try to set up for damage, so I would just ultimately go with something that doesn't need reloading as a fragment if that's what you're going to go for on Warlock for DPS. And unfortunately the reload is sort of where Prismatic Warlock falls short, is when you're doing like boss DPS and you need to have instant reloads. Strand Warlock and Solar Warlock with Rain of Fire are still kind of going to be the king for that. However, Prismatic Warlock has a lot of things going for it, like the super high survivability, the actually really good uptime on all of the abilities like Sunbracer tier uptime without using Sunbracers or even any exotic. And with access to the Song of Flame, it's actually a decent support super for DPS by essentially rendering invulnerability to all of the teammates. It is important to remember though that unlike Well of Radiance, it does not give the teammates Radiant or any sort of global damage buff, so you'll want to run something like Lumina to make sure your teammates are still getting a weapon damage buff during DPS with Song of Flame. Of course, you could also just run Needlestorm for DPS. People have been saying that Nova Bomb is also really good for DPS. I haven't been able to test the 2 yet. However, if you guys do have any numbers and you want to tell me in the comments section what you guys have found, let me know if Nova Bomb seems better. One thing important about Nova Bomb, if you do use that as your super, is the Facet of Purpose is going to give you Void Overshield, which is a pretty terrible healing verb, and you might want to take off that fragment, or just realize that you're kind of wasting that fragment in your DPS build. I know that this video didn't really cover the double exotic perks on the class items very much, but that's mostly because the Warlock class items aren't really all that amazing overall. Pretty much it's got the Spirit of Star Eater, which is obviously going to be super good for damage by increasing the damage of supers that have not been able to be damage buffed in the past. However, other than that, it doesn't really have anything amazing. I'm probably just going to go with a Necrotic plus Star Eater's class item myself, just so that I have the extra effect on my super. And I still get access to the very potent ag clear on Necrotics, as well as the slight increase in damage to boss damage that Necrotics adds, just like it did for Strand Warlock. I know a lot of people are also interested in the Apotheosis Star Eaters combo, however I don't think that's going to be very powerful, at least in the way that they think. I think if anything that will be decent with something like Needlestorm. However, a lot of people are trying to use it with Song of Flame to just throw a ton of grenades and melees, but honestly, grenades and melees are not really amazing when it comes to boss DPS. Like, the numbers they do just isn't really that high. It is very easy and consistent damage, so that might be helpful to some people, but ultimately it's just not a large number of damage, and you're generally just better spending your time shooting your gun. So that's sort of my thoughts on that hyped up combo. However, you guys should definitely let me know your thoughts in the comments about that. And there weren't really a lot of amazing and super hyped up combos other than that, so I'm probably not going to talk much more on it. If you want to use the loadout I'm going to be using, it's probably going to be Necrotics plus Star Eaters, and using the Prismatic build that I will have linked in the description down below, which is mostly the one I've already highlighted here. I also thought I'd let you guys know I have a Discord server and we have an entire channel dedicated to basically putting build links that people can use for themselves. I've put a couple of links in there, and I've also had some other friends put them in, as well as some other creators put their builds in there. So if you're looking for some good builds to use for anything, definitely join my Discord, check that channel out, you won't regret it. And I'll have the link to my Discord down below in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye!